Ladies and gentlemen, this is El Cochino, Tom Lawler, and I'd like to welcome you to the podcast that puts the lotion on its own skin, LuchaWorld. Bitchin'.
Welcome everyone to LuchaWorld Podcast episode number 122. Fredo Esparza here, and this week I am going to discuss the Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Fame, the 2020 edition, as I have a ballot this year, much like last year. Last year I did a podcast, but it was on Patreon for the retro wrestling podcast that I do on there. But this year, since most of my ballot is lucha related, and so was last year, but more so this year, because there's at least some slight difference. I figured I would put it up on this podcast since it's different. You know, usually for about 4 or 5 years, we discussed whenever I would do a podcast about the Hall of Fame, be it on here or, you know, when I was guest appearing on some other podcasts, it was always like the same group of luchadors. And this year there's a little bit of a difference just because so many guys went in 2019, like Ultimo Guerrero. I think Viano Tercero was one of the other people. And I think there were a total of 4 to 5, probably 4 luchadors, obviously including Misioneros de la Muerte, that made it into the Observer Hall of Fame. So that kind of emptied out a little bit. And so this year there were a few more new names added to the ballot. And a few of them actually made my ballot as my picks. Slightly different from last year, my ballot, but pretty much about the same. I focus more on Lucha Libre because obviously being a Lucha fan and researching a lot of Lucha Libre over the past couple of years, especially now that I do a lot of stuff for not just for LuchaWorld, but on the Patreon site as well. I'm doing the Lucha Magazine write-ups. I figured I would do this a little bit different. Well, I wouldn't say it's different, more so the fact that now I have a little bit more, you know, it's always good as you do research, you get a little more of an understanding about the history of pro wrestling, and you get to learn more about certain wrestlers and what they were really like. And also there's so much more video available with, you know, YouTube, WWE Network, that you could see a little bit more of that. Even with luchadors, there's been a few luchadors that I've seen on WWE Network through World Class and a couple of the other promotions that have brought in luchadors in the past that have actually made it onto YouTube. The Houston stuff, there's a lot of stuff from Houston that has popped up from the NWA. I think it was when the NWA uncovered a lot of that stuff. Not Billy Corgan, but the person before that. Someone actually uploaded a lot of that stuff. So you actually see a lot of the luchadors in Texas. So you kind of get more, you know, a lot of the guys that we didn't get to see because there's very little footage of Lucha Libre prior to the 90s, from the 70s, 80s and beyond. There isn't that much. So just getting a little bit more from what they did in the United States, in Texas primarily, it's added a little bit more more ways to find out a little bit more about what the wrestlers were like. I mean, Rene Guajardo, I don't think I had ever seen him wrestle prior to seeing him on World Class against El Solitario on I think it was one of the Fritz von Erich retirement show. They had a match, and he was really an excellent wrestler. And this is Rene Guajardo in 1981, 82, and it's like, you know, you got to remember his prime years were like the 60s, and he was still looking very good in the ring. So that just goes to show how talented some of the wrestlers were. And I think that's something that has kind of helped I think that's probably what helped Rene Guajardo, making it into the Hall of Fame so early on, was that, you know, some Dave Meltzer and other, not only did they have the history behind what he had done, but they had also had a chance to see him in Texas. Even though it was later in his career, they got to see him, and, you know, that kind of helped. So that's actually helped quite a bit. This year, I voted for 10 wrestlers. I picked 10 wrestlers for my ballot, and 5 non-wrestlers were also included in my ballot. Usually I try to go with honestly, since I've only been voting the last 2 years, there's been enough people for me to consider worthy candidates that I would definitely vote for. it's not like suddenly there's nobody on there that I wouldn't vote for, just because. And I do know that I've heard a lot of people talk about their ballots, and there's been a few, like Mike Tenay, who was on the Observer radio podcast in the last couple of weeks, couple of days. He's kind of mentioned that he's had certain times when he sent in his ballot, and he hasn't had that many people that he voted for, just because he didn't think they were like, there wasn't as many people that he considered Hall of Fame level. I kind of view it a little differently, just because, and everybody kind of does. I think there's plenty of wrestlers that I think are Hall of Fame worthy, but there's also, I think all of us have a certain line that will, that's the Hall of Fame, and then everybody's just like either really good and isn't necessarily Hall of Fame worthy. So I guess I'll go through my ballot. If this show is only 30 minutes long, I apologize, but I figured this would be something fun to talk about. The first category is the I Followed the Modern Performers in US, Canada, and Canada candidates. There's an actual other ballot. Before that category, there is the I Followed the Historical Performers Era candidates. I didn't vote for anybody on that, but I'll get back to that later on if we have some time, just because on it, I really didn't think anybody was at that level. That could always change down the road, just because, like I said, as you get to learn more about certain wrestlers, their value kind of either increases or decreases or stays the same. And for a few of the guys on the historical era, I would say there's a few that I think have gotten kind of closer, just because I had never really seen a lot of their work early on, and some of that I have seen that have definitely greatly improved their odds of me considering to vote for them later on. But as far as the modern performers from the US and Canada, my vote this year went to Sergeant Slaughter. It really came down in this category between Sergeant Slaughter, Junkyard Dog, and Kerry Von Erich. Last year I voted for Kerry Von Erich. Junkyard Dog was kind of like pretty close to Kerry. The only difference between the two is that I kind of thought Kerry was a bigger star. And like I said, I lived during the 80s, I lived in Texas, so I kind of knew a little bit more about Kerry Von Erich at that time. I kind of started watching Junkyard Dog when he joined WWE, and he wasn't at that point in time quite the level of worker, whereas Kerry I kind of saw before that. And he was really, really, the Von Erich family was extremely popular, not just as wrestlers in Texas, but also as kind of like a cultural phenomena in Texas. Very similar to what a lot of luchadors you get from luchadors in Mexico, like El Santo. Not quite at that level, but, pretty high up there. But this year, as I said, I voted for Sergeant Slaughter. And the reason I did was I've been watching a lot of Sergeant Slaughter the last couple of, and he was somebody I was considering last year. He was kind of around the time that I sent in my ballot, was around the time I started watching a lot of Sergeant Slaughter's work. And I gotta say, he's been amazing, a great all-around performer. I first saw Sergeant Slaughter later in his career, so really when he was in, the whole G.I. Joe thing. So he was more, to me, just a huge star and a character than anything, like a cartoon type of character, which you kind of had that with a lot of the WWF guys at that time, like Hulk Hogan, Junkyard Dog, Hillbilly Jim, Jimmy Snuka, the list of those guys, kind of Iron Sheik. Slaughter kind of fell into that group for me at that point in time, because he was kind of, like I said, he was in G.I. Joe and all that stuff. So he had his own action figure, not just G.I. Joe, but also, as a wrestler. But more importantly, the G.I. Joe action figure and being in the cartoon was such a huge deal. And but I mostly just thought of him at that level, which that alone is impressive. But then once I started watching a lot of his earlier stuff before he turned babyface and he was more of a heel, the guy is incredible in the ring as well. He's very good on the mic also, very good at cutting promos. He's one of those guys that actually can, he would throw in a little bit of humor into his promos, since he's being a serious drill instructor, drill sergeant, that it kind of came off a little bit comedic at certain points, but he could always get in the whole seriousness of it. But in the ring, he was outstanding. for a big guy, he was really good at bumping, and he could actually wrestle. That was the other thing. I kind of I was more familiar with him mostly being a brawler, but there were times that I've seen him on Mid Atlantic Championship Wrestling, where he's working against somebody who's more of a technical wrestler, and because he's kind of trying to like show off his technical ability, he does do a few a little bit of mat wrestling, but for the most part, it's very much just a brawling style that he has, but very aggressive, and I thought he was awesome. He as a heel. Also, he had an incredible WWF run early on. His matches with Pat Patterson, so many other wrestlers that he had great matches with in WWF. And then later on, as you go along, his AWA stuff, even some of his AWA stuff, I saw him wrestle Stan Hansen, and that match was fantastic too. I think it was like a 14-15 minute match, but just a terrific brawl. So, it's very different when you watch a wrestler when you're a kid and you're not really thinking about work rate. You just think he's tough or awesome or cool. And you don't really think about the other stuff that he's doing. You don't really like put much thought into it. But now once I started watching all this stuff, you start to realize that this guy was very talented. Also, he had the heel run later in his career, feuding against Hulk Hogan. So to me, he had enough, a 12 to 13 year period where he was an outstanding wrestler. A couple of years where he, because he was a G.I. Joe and he was kind of like, living off of being a more of a bigger celebrity, a mainstream media celebrity. He maybe didn't do as much for a couple of years, especially later when the AWA kind of started to fall apart. But the rest of the stuff, he was outstanding. But so he was the one person I voted for from the modern performers in U.S. and Canada. The next category was the I Follow Wrestling in Japan candidates. And in this one, last year I voted for Akira Taue, and this year I voted for him again. But this year I added a second pick, and that was Jun Akiyama. This is probably more so my bias towards All Japan Pro Wrestling from the 90s, which is an amazing era of pro wrestling. If you have never watched 1990s All Japan Pro Wrestling, I don't know what you've been doing as far as watching wrestling, because that is by far one of my favorite eras. I'm a big fan of the style that they used. It's unfortunate that it's a style that was very rough as well, but as far as just being a fan, it's something that I really enjoyed. And Akira Taue, one of the four pillars of All Japan Pro Wrestling, I think a lot of people kind of always viewed him as the fourth guy in that group behind Misawa, Kawada, and Kobashi. Because those guys were a little bit flashier and they did a little bit more, but Taue was awesome. The choke slam, every time he went for that choke slam, you knew something, he was going to go for it, and it kind of got a lot of the crowd response to it was always great. So to me, Taue was just, he may have not been at the level of those three, but he was still pretty darn good. To me, it's kind of like Taue to me was always kind of like that, just the consistent good wrestler. He knew how to, and it's always like when people talk about he wasn't that great. I mean, you watch those matches, the tag matches, the 6-man tags, he is very much a big part of those matches. He's not hiding in those matches. No one is covering up for him or making him look good. He actually does some stuff that helps himself and makes everybody else look good. There's no slowdown in those tag or 6-man tags that they were a part of. He very much is a big part of that. There's been a few people that have had debates about who is the best of the four pillars, and obviously people start. But honestly, you could go with any four, and you'd be, you can't go wrong with any of them. It's really, I think people will always pick Misawa or Kobashi as the top one, and maybe throw in Kawada as some people will go with Kawada, and Taue will always kind of be like the fourth. But Taue, he was awesome, and if you're gonna go as far as Hall of Fame level in an era, and how like certain promotions have a handful of guys, it's kind of like baseball. If you have or football or basketball where you have a team that dominates a decade or a certain period of time, and you put into the Hall of Fame, like it's kind of like, I'll use the example like the Los Angeles Lakers or Boston Celtics of the 80s. Each of those teams had 3 to 4 great players, And you're not gonna like, just because someone was like the third or fourth best doesn't necessarily mean he doesn't deserve to be in the Hall of Fame, because odds are what he was doing at that time was very high level, high end. Like if you look at the Lakers, they had James Worthy as their third guy in the 80s, and he's very much a Hall of Famer. You look at the Celtics, Robert Parrish was a huge one of the top centers during the 80s, and definitely like nobody would ever put him down as one of the greats during that time period. So I think Towie, for me, that's how I view him. That great other player in All Japan Pro Wrestling. And Akiyama, I mean, he came in a little bit afterwards, but very much a big part of All Japan the late 90s run from 96 forward. The guy was awesome. Tag team wrestler, singles wrestler, everything he was great at. Pretty much he continued the tradition of the four pillars. And then when the whole split came and he was like the main guy in Noah, he was still very good. One of those guys that he comes in, and that's not just for Noah, but like when they started doing all those shows where he would show up for other promotions, they would announce Akiyama as one of the challengers to whoever was the guy who was going to wrestle from that, either New Japan or later on All Japan. And you were really looking forward to that match because that was something that was something new, and you knew what Akiyama's reputation was. And also he had a very long career where he's been one of the top workers, great wrestlers in Japan. I had to vote for him. He's amazing. And then there's the next category, which was I followed wrestling in Mexico candidates. And this one, we actually got a couple of people into the Hall of Fame last year. And this year, they added some new faces into the ballot. And there were a few of them that I actually immediately considered just because I think they definitely deserve it. Medico Asesino was on my list, was one of my picks. And one of the top stars in the 1950s, one of the first TV stars of Lucha Libre in Mexico. If he had not passed away at such a young age, I think he passed away at age 40 or so. Yeah, at age 40, coming into his age 40, he would have been I think that's what's happened. He's kind of become the forgotten legend of Lucha Libre because he was a heavyweight, and really like a lot of the remembering of the legends of the past, there's a lot of connection that a lot of the promotions, like especially CMLL, which brings it up a lot more because they're the promotion that has the connection to that, whereas AAA is more connected to the what they started and what they've done with their promotion in the last 27 years. With CMLL, when they bring up like who's held titles, it very much focused into the welterweight division. And with Medico Asesino, you don't hear much about him because he was a heavyweight, and that wasn't the prestigious division of Lucha Libre. The welterweight division has continued to become the more popular, the more where all the bigger stars are at, either for most of their career or for much of their career, because a lot of the guys stay at that weight class. You also get that a little bit more with the middleweights, and then as the weight class starts to increase, it kind of, you don't get that same remembrance of the legends from the past. But Medico Asesino was one of the first TV stars being part of Televicentro, that promotion. And obviously later on, he not only was he a star in Mexico, but also in Texas. Got to wrestle Lutes 4 times for the NWA World Heavyweight title. And so that alone right there kind of tells you how big of a star and how big of an impact he had. Next pick I had was Los Brazos. Brazo de Oro, Brazo de Plata, and El Brazo. To me, those guys are if you're going to have Los Misioneros de la Muerte in the Hall of Fame, Los Brazos also belong. I think a lot of people kind of might dismiss them because they're not as familiar with what they did. But I mean, they were a headline act as a trio in Mexico, especially later in UWA's run from like the late 80s. Big time. Their feud with the Villanos was huge. Not only what they did with UWA, but later on with EMLL and later CMLL, they had a lot of They were just one of those great trios. Super Porky kind of gets a little bit more of the praise because he was, of his charisma, and really he's kind of like the one who kind of remained as one of the top stars in CMLL still later in his career, until he started having to suffering from health issues. But and obviously his brother's passing away a little bit sooner. But and actually even like Brazo de Oro retired at semi-retired. He didn't really like retire because he was still kind of having occasional matches, but you still had Los Brazos who were awesome. I still remember when they would tour around northern Mexico, and they would always make their way to Juarez, and how much hype there was behind the Juarez, Los Brazos showing up in Juarez, and having some pretty great trios matches. They had some great trios matches with like Los Infernales, Misioneros, like I said, Villanos. Los Bucaneros were also another great rivalry that they had in '89. Just a lot of, and they even wrestled the Guerrero family a couple of times in EMLL. And also, I'm sure they wrestled elsewhere. I'm pretty sure they wrestled even in Juarez a few times. But a great trio. They headlined a few shows as well, so they're not some trio that just randomly belongs. I think they also had the time together as well. That's one of the things that kind of like was when looking at tag teams or trios that get nominated or are candidates for the Hall of Fame. You also kind of have to consider longevity, and these guys had that. Brazo de Oro and Brazo de Plata were together since probably like 1980, and then Brazo joined them I think 2 years later or 3 years later when they finally formed the trio. So definitely I do think they're definitely Hall of Fame worthy. But like I said, that's one of the things that unless you've actually like researched, it's very hard for a lot of people to vote for people in the Mexico section, because I think a lot of it comes down to the eye test, and for whatever reason it takes a lot longer for certain people to get in. And but I do think Los Brazos belong. Caristico is my next pick, and I think for the most part the majority of fans who would vote in this category would have at least either been experienced the Mystico era where they actually got to see what it was all about, or at the very least there's enough footage available where they've at least watched it and they're a little more familiar with it, or they've actually heard stories about how big the Mystico boom was. Really the last big boom in Lucha Libre in Mexico. I mean, this guy was like a top draw, like a huge star, not just as far as when you look at Mexico, but somebody who was, considered a big star internationally. People outside of Mexico kind of viewed him as a big star, and he was a big draw, not just in Mexico City, but throughout Mexico. I think that WWE run hurts him, but at the same time, I don't think it should hurt him. There's so many other people that went through WWE and didn't succeed that are on this ballot, and I kind of think that at certain points you have to look at whether or not what happened in WWE, what outweighs that more. The 4 or 5 years where he was the top draw, not just Mexico, but if you look at top draw as far as somebody around the world, and you look at the numbers he was putting up, compare them to people at the same point in time in WWE or in Japan, anywhere else in the United States or anywhere else, he was always like a very like top. He was very high on the list, and does that outweigh what he did in WWE, where he kind of just completely fell? It was horrible, a horrible run, partly WWE's fault, but also partly his own fault, and that's happened to a lot of luchadors that have gone to WWE. But to be fair, I mean, other than Rey Mysterio, I don't really see anybody else who's having this incredible success in WWE. I mean, even like somebody like Alberto Patron has that, and he spoke English. He had a pretty good run, but because of his own ego, it's kind of also hurt him, and not just his fault, but also WWE. So that's kind of like been an issue with a lot of the luchadors when they go to WWE. And also, honestly, I don't think WWE really gives these guys, or not just even WWE, any promotion in the United States doesn't give these guys the same opportunity that they would give somebody who is an English speaking wrestler. they seem to like not realize that a lot of times some of these guys are able to like, I mean, and even if you look at Caristico when he was Sin Cara, he was still very popular with the fans. It really took once WWE soured on him, they kind of pretty much lost interest in him. He was still very popular with the fans. It really came down once, the whole thing where he suffered that injury against Alberto, and they just cast him away, and that was basically the end of it. But I mean, I don't think that was a very like, it wasn't a particularly long run that was a disaster in WWE. Because once he got out and he went, first to AAA and then came back to CMLL. Since coming back to CMLL, he's very much redeemed himself as far as being a star. The one flaw that he has is that he's joining CMLL at a point where their programming department is kind of not at the level, and they're really not very good, and they've kind of hurt themselves. CMLL has really hurt themselves by just losing so much talent, and also they've been kind of out of focus, the programming department, for the past couple of years, where they're just throwing anything onto the wall to to see what sticks. And unfortunately, their talent level has really dropped in the last 3 years, and that's been unfortunate, and it's hurt Caristico. And he's always asked about being given the ball again, and trying to elevate CMLL again, see if he could bring a boom. And I think he can. I mean, there's been points where he's done, the match with Pentagon Jr. kind of proves that if you put Caristico against somebody who's special that isn't from CMLL, or maybe even like somebody from CMLL that's a little bit just something different, it could draw. I think it still will happen. Right now they're having him team up with the current Mystico, and that tag team. I think that tag team can draw well, because people want to see that tag team, and then at some point they're going to want to see the breakup and the eventual big mass match between the two. And I think CML really should build to that. They have enough time where they could actually do it. Unfortunately, with the pandemic that's going on right now, in a way it may have helped them, because they could just keep focusing on Caristico and Mystico as a tag team. And they're doing more tag team wrestling of late, because of they're not filling out their shows with. They got rid of one match. It's basically 5 matches on a show every so while. I mean, the anniversary had 7 matches, but the regular Friday shows have 5 matches. And depending on tournaments, I should mention also, if there's tournaments, they obviously go further, longer, more matches. But usually it's 5 matches, and then they'll in the past, usually we would get so many trios matches, but right now we're seeing more singles and tag matches. So right now is a good time for them to start building up Caristico and Mystico as a very formidable tag team. And maybe down the line, when they do eventually do the breakup and there's fans finally attending shows, that could become the big build up to a big mass match at an anniversary show, which I think would actually sell out Arena Mexico. It would probably be a big deal. Obviously, I think Caristico would have to win that, but at least that would be the big match that would seal his legacy, and would probably seal his Hall of Fame candidacy. I also voted for Sangre Chicana, one of the top stars from the late 70s all the way through the early 90s, one of the best brawlers of all time, in not just lucha libre but in professional wrestling. And what I believe of him as being a great brawler is that he not only would, get a lot of offense, but he was very good at selling and bumping for his opponents. So the brawl would actually be so much cooler, because there was actually a little bit more of a, it wasn't just one-sided. There was, there was always a two, each side would get an opportunity. Very similar to like Terry Funk in that way, where, it wasn't, he would be a terrific brawler, but he would always give and take a little bit in a match. It wasn't just all take, something that was more common with Bruiser Brody as a brawler. But Sangre Chicana was awesome. Great feuds with Perro Aguayo, MS1. There's so many guys. One of the top middleweights in professional wrestling early in his career. Then he became a light heavyweight. What was so awesome, also feuds with Satanico. What was so cool about him is that when he would step into the ring, you knew, something was going to happen, because you could get that. He was one of those, certain wrestlers, when they step into the ring, into the arena, They bring in a certain energy and you get that buzz, that feel. And he was one of those guys. I think what hurt Sangre Chicana is that he still continued to wrestle later in his career, and he was a lot older, a lot slower. And a lot of people kind of like started talking about, the more there was more talk about him not being a very good wrestler. By this, I mean that, in Mexico, a lot of people believe that the only good wrestlers are wrestlers that are mat wrestlers or wrestlers that know llaveo, the llaveo style, which is, holds. And they frown upon high flying wrestlers and brawlers. And a lot of times, a lot of those brawlers aren't just brawlers. They could actually do a lot of the other stuff, but they make their money bleeding and, and brawling. And that's what pays the rent, and that's what they do. And people kind of forget about, like, they kind of dismiss that, but that's another style of pro wrestling, and he did it very well. The MS Uno matches are fantastic. That alone should get him into the Hall of Fame. The other thing is that if you go back to about from 78 to up until like 82, 83, there was always a big debate as to who was the best wrestler in Mexico at that point in time. Since Mil Mascaras was more of a traveling wrestler, so he wasn't necessarily a guy who was, all the time in Mexico. He was usually in the United States or in Japan during that time period. But with the three guys who always were in the debate as who was the best wrestler or the top star in Mexico, was always, it came down to Paraguayo, Sangre Chicana, and Canek. Those were the three guys that that was a big debate. Which one of these guys is the best wrestler in Mexico? Solitario was more of another wrestler that was more of a traveling wrestler at that point in time, where he was more, not just wrestling in Mexico, but also in the United States and in Japan and other parts of the world. But with them three, it was always the big debate between those three. Solitario was kind of like the other guy that was thrown in there, but those three were always the ones discussed. As far as like the bigger stars, and Chicana was awesome. I think he definitely belongs. My next pick was Karloff Lagarde, without a doubt. I mean, the guy was one of the more dominant wrestlers in the 60s, one of the top welterweights in Lucha Libre history. When they start rolling out doing the roll call of all the welterweights, when CMLL does that, when there's a big welterweight title match, and they start mentioning Karloff Lagarde and Gory Guerrero, El Santo, Blue Demon, everybody that they bring up from the past, you start to hear about. And then Karloff Lagarde, you look at his career. This was a guy who was in the 60s was considered one of the best wrestlers in Mexico. One of the things that goes against him is that there's no footage. You really nothing, unless I think there's maybe some movie clips that he was maybe in, like the highlight reel type of deal that they would do. But there really isn't a lot of footage, and that obviously would hurt him. And also, a lot of the magazine stuff, there's not, like, during the 60s, because a lot of the magazines mostly focus in Mexico City or Mexico State, and they would only sporadically mention maybe Monterrey, Guadalajara, and Tijuana, Juarez, the northern region of Mexico, would get less coverage than those Mexico City and Mexico State. So a lot of the guys who maybe would work for EMLL, they might work 40 or 50 shows during the year in Mexico City or Puebla, the two places that would get a lot of coverage or get upcoming show results, but you wouldn't get anywhere else. But once you start realizing that these guys are wrestling outside of Mexico, Guadalajara was one of the places that they would constantly go to. Acapulco also, Monterrey, all over all over Mexico. So unfortunately, we don't get a lot of that information. So we don't really know. You start getting it sporadically. You get it with a handful of magazines. So I think honestly, I think it's going to take going through like thousands of magazines before we finally get more of a clearer understanding of what everybody was doing during the 60s, 70s, and the 80s. I think the 90s forward is pretty much, there's enough information where you can make a decision on a lot of wrestlers from that time period. But before that, before 1990 or before 1988 or so, it's a little bit harder to have a lot of information on those guys. So once we go through all those magazines and all that stuff, I think there's going to be, and it doesn't help that it would help that more people in Mexico would actually do this as well. Lagarde, I'm not sure if he's going to get in now. He definitely belongs. I mean, he's probably Medico Asesino, Karloff, Lagarde, and Huracan Ramirez are probably like the three big names that should be added next from this Mexico section. But because honestly, if they don't go in through here, they're not going to go through that historical performers list, because there's definitely going to be fewer people voting for them on that list, because they're going to overlook them for the American or the Japanese wrestlers or whoever else that is from a more known part of the world. To me, I think Lagarde has to be in. He's also part of one of the great tag teams in Mexican wrestling history with Rene Guajardo. Both of them, I mean, that's probably one of the probably like I've not made a list of the greatest tag teams of all time in Mexico, but they have to be in the top 10. I mean, top 5 at least, as far as greatest tag teams in Mexican wrestling history. My next pick was Pirata Morgan. Definitely a guy I believe belongs in the Hall of Fame. One of the great wrestlers from the 80s, early 90s. Just an awesome wrestler. Trios matches, part of the Infernales. Also a great singles wrestler on his own. So Pirata Morgan has a hair match with Mario Dandy Gallegos, known in Lucha Libre as Jalisco Segundo, Jalisco number 2. This is something that actually also gets mentioned. I mentioned in a podcast, a Lucha Classica podcast, is that a lot of people, when they did the results for that match, that hair match between Pirata Morgan and Jalisco Segundo, they actually list Jalisco, the first one, which is Apollo Jalisco, who's a Southern California wrestler now. But Jalisco Segundo, who wrestled as Mario Dandy Gallegos, he's the one that wrestled him in the hair match. And what happened in that match, Pirata Morgan goes for a tope suicida to the outside. Jalisco Segundo moves out of the way. Morgan ends up hitting a ringside seat face first, basically the armrest. He hits it face first and actually nearly loses his eye from that injury. He ends up losing it actually, but during that point in time, you see blood from his flowing out of his eye. He gets back in the ring. He actually wins the match against Jalisco Segundo. He wins a hair match, having no vision from one eye. He actually told the story about how in this eye, as it went along, he could still see a little bit, but he started seeing more and more red. And by the time he won the match, he was seeing all red in that one eye and was starting to feel faint. And they immediately took him to the hospital. He woke up. He was knocked out. He had suffered, pretty much got knocked out from that. And when he woke up, the doctor told him he had to take out his eye. Otherwise, he would lose the vision from his other eye. And so that's how he lost his eye. Added the eye patch, and Pirata Morgan became an even bigger deal. The funny thing is, like when I mentioned this on the Lucha Classica podcast, Pirata Morgan believed his eye was cursed because twice as a child he nearly lost his eye from some injuries that he suffered, some accidents, and he always felt fortunate at that point in time. And when it finally happened, when he was wrestling, he just figured it was fate that he was going to lose an eye. And to win a hair match like that kind of tells you, but the guy is an outstanding wrestler, just an amazing worker, amazing matches with so many wrestlers, Dandy, Vampiro, he had a sellout crowd, a sellout in Arena Mexico against Vampiro, I think it was 1 or 2 years after the big Rayo de Jalisco Cien Caras mass match. Those two had a match that drew a huge sellout as well. Pirata Morgan, I think he's another person that kind of becomes a victim of being around for too long, because he started gaining a lot of weight and he wasn't as agile as he was when he was younger, became more of a brawler and not as great of a worker. But still, if you go from all the 1980s all the way up to about 93, 94, the guy was an outstanding wrestler. Definitely a Hall of Fame worthy wrestler to me, he definitely is a Hall of Famer. And my final pick from this was actually Huracan Ramirez. I mean, honestly, the guy is one of the all-time great luchadors. if you look at the evolution of lucha libre and pro wrestling, because a lot of the high flying style has to be credited to Mexican wrestling, is even into the United States, because a lot of those guys, like Chavo Guerrero, Ricky Morton. Ricky Morton didn't get it as much from lucha, but I'm sure he watched a lot of guys who maybe were in lucha in Mexico, and Chavo Guerrero being one of those guys. All the Guerreros brought that to the United States, and then you also had Mil Mascaras and all the guys from Mexico, and then you had a lot of American wrestlers who went to Mexico, who actually took some of that and brought it to the United States. So you get that as well. But a lot of that, the evolution, should be credited to Huracan Ramirez, as he was one of those early high flyers. Him and Rayo de Jalisco Sr., they were definitely the two of the early high flyers. You talk about like them doing topes to the outside or planchas. They were definitely the first two guys. Then later on you had guys like Matematico, and then later on Rey Mysterio Jr. and all these other guys who later on took it to a whole new level. But really, Huracan Ramirez is somebody that definitely belongs in the Hall of Fame. A star in Mexico. I think what hurts him more than anything else, not that he wasn't like somebody who kind of, to me, his biggest issue is that there's been so many people who have kind of used his name that it's kind of diminished him as a star, because there's so many other Huracan Ramirez's, and then there's this, it just became a big mess. I think that kind of diminishes it for him. Also, the fact that there were so many other guys during his era that were huge stars, like I said, Rayo de Jalisco, El Santo, Blue Demon, Solitario. So you have so many guys who were like huge stars, not just in Mexico but outside of Mexico. But Huracan Ramirez is definitely somebody I had to pick for the Hall of Fame. And there were other guys who were included in this that I didn't I didn't vote for. The other candidates from Mexico were Jerry Estrada, La Fiera, Alberto Muñoz, and Rito Romero. Romero is somebody that I think is going to require a lot of research on, because I think he's somebody that not only was a star in Mexico but also in the United States, in Texas. So there might be something where there might be more of him in Texas, or in the western portion of the United States, as opposed to maybe what you might not get from Mexico, information on him. Alberto Muñoz, I think he was somebody that was on his way to becoming an all-time, maybe not an all-time great, but somebody who was a Hall of Fame worthy wrestler. But the injury that he suffered, really set him back. Fortunately, it wasn't anything that was too serious, and he was able to continue to wrestle. Later became White Man to as part of a tag team with Black Man, although that didn't last that long in UWA. But to me, Munoz, another guy who was a great wrestler in one of the lighter weight classes. But the fact that happened to him so early in his, at a point where is kind of, honestly, he's kind of like one of those guys who you would probably say maybe he was like in those 10 or so years where he was already getting ready to become a huge star. And unfortunately that injury happened, and he wasn't able to get to that point. Jerry Estrada and La Fiera, excellent wrestlers. But to me, I kind of view them still kind of not quite there. There's guys in in the other categories that I would actually consider higher than them. But Estrada and La Fiera also, they're kind of guys who were their own worst enemies as far as why I wouldn't consider them. Estrada had a lot of personal issues, that have been talked about by a lot of people in Lucha Libre. And with La Fiera, he actually had some issues as well in the 80s, where he would like show a lot of lucha shows. And him and Mocho Cota had a habit of doing that. If you go through Lucha magazines in the 80s, you constantly hear about how there were promoters who kind of like were going to blacklist them because they would no-show them at certain points because they're partying. Those were the stories you would hear. You wouldn't hear them like you had to read in between the lines, because the people reporting weren't necessarily, but you would get the hint that they were like really, he was somebody who liked to party. So sometimes he didn't make it to shows, unfortunately. But they were also the guys that, I would have to like, I did get to watch them a lot, and I thought they were excellent wrestlers. But like I said, in this in this group of luchadors, they're definitely not as high as some of the ones that I mentioned. Like I said, Medico Asesino, Huracan Ramirez, and Karloff Lagarde to me are guys that are no brainers. Caristico the same. I think he's somebody who's a no brainer Hall of Famer. Los Brazos, Sangre Chicana, and Pirata Morgan are probably more going to be some wrestlers that I think it's going to like vary on depending on when you watch them and how much you know about them. But they're definitely, to me, they're definitely Hall of Fame worthy. And then finally, the non wrestlers. I picked 5 this year, and again, I voted for Dave Brown, Bob Caudle, the Grand Wizard. I voted for all 3 of them last year, and this year, new to my list were Ted Turner and Mike Tenay. Ted Turner, I think he was on last year's ballot, but I didn't vote for him because at first, I thought, Ted Turner, he's just the billionaire. But then I realized, really, without him, they're Georgia Championship Wrestling, WCW, the NWA, we wouldn't have gotten all that stuff. And I think that's enough for me to he definitely gave the opportunity for wrestling to be on cable television. So that was a huge deal, and definitely, plus he opened up his checkbook for WCW for one of the most amazing runs. The amount of talent that WCW had during from 96 through 98, 99 was amazing. And if you're going to talk about somebody put some money into the promotion, he definitely did. And he was able to see a lot of success from that. And then Mike Tenay, I think with Mike Tenay, not only just as an announcer, but also how much he, meant to Lucha Libre as far as getting people to actually get into Lucha Libre. And I would say he had the greatest reach of anyone who's covered Lucha Libre or was a fan of Lucha Libre as far as trying to attract more fans to discover this style of wrestling. To me, he had a far greater opportunity. I mean, they're behind Mike Tenay. I would say, Dr. Lucha and the Cubs fan are probably the 2 people that have done a lot for Lucha Libre as far as for English speaking fans or not the non-Mexican fans, as far as getting people to not just learn about Lucha Libre but to follow it, see it, a lot of this, but they don't have the reach. I mean, they don't have a WCW Nitro that they could appear on to promote Lucha Libre and talk about and rave about, Rey Mysterio Jr., Juventud Guerrera, Los Villanos, Super Calo, Hector Garza, all these guys, Psychosis, La Parca, all these wrestlers that the TNA was able to do. And, he tried to do it with Impact as well when TNA first started. He wanted to bring in Ricky Marvin and some of these the luchadors that were hot during the early 2000s. He had a lot of ideas that he wanted to do, but unfortunately, it's very difficult for you get a lot of promoters who they're very stubborn and set in their ways, and what worked for them is what they stick to. And unfortunately, they're sometimes very late to the party when it comes to bringing in Lucha Libre, different styles or different types of wrestlers, and that was unfortunate. But to me, like I said, I think what Tenay did in WCW was fantastic. He's a great announcer. And honestly, I think that's where I would consider him that, much like Bob Caudle and Dave Brown. Dave Brown, he was a big part of what made Memphis wrestling work. There are points, and I've been watching a lot of Memphis wrestling, and there's a lot of points where that TV show is basically, the star versus a jobber, or you might get some young guys working against jobbers, enhancement talent. It's not particularly great matches, but they're able to do the match happens, and then they can continue the way the show flows is so well done, because not only do they have the matches, but they also have the interviews, the promos, and then you obviously have Dave Brown and Lance Russell's back and forth talking about the show during the matches or during the times that they have the breaks where they're just talking about what's coming up or to promote the shows. I think he does a fantastic job, much like Lance Russell did. Same goes with Bob Caudle. I mean, I remember listening to Bob Caudle when he would do NWA's the not the syndicated shows, not necessarily the big shows. And he was usually sometimes doing with Lance Russell, I think. And but I've been watching a lot of Mid-Atlantic and Smoky Mountain Wrestling, and there you see a lot of the what he did really well, not just as an announcer, but also as an interviewer and somebody who's continuing to build the storylines. Very much part, the announcers are very much a part of like continuing the progression of storylines, because they have to remind the fans what's happening with certain wrestlers, and if you don't have that, odds are you're not going to be able to, like, the fans are just going to lose interest in it, because if there's nobody else reminding them about it or continuing it on, they're just, like I said, if it doesn't matter to them, why should we care? And Grand Wizard, I think one of the terrific managers of all time, definitely belongs. Also helps that I saw an episode of All Star Wrestling, WWF All Star Wrestling from the 1970s. And let me just say, these shows are very difficult to watch, because they are, some of the WWF guys are very, very boring, very slow. It's a very slow moving show, and it's the atmosphere very old school. It's very different. And I've seen some Florida wrestling from the same time period and Georgia Championship Wrestling, and that stuff just blows away what was going on in WWF. That stuff was just rough. And there's this one interview where Grand Wizard just he's just awesome. Like, his interviews, he's just going, the what his promo work is fantastic. Him just going back and forth with Vince McMahon and his whoever he's with managing, just fantastic job. I think he's a terrific manager. Also, I actually saw him, I think he was managing the Sheik or somebody when in that I Like to Hurt People movie, and I always thought he was fantastic in that as well. Definitely someone I think belongs. Just like I said, I enjoy doing this stuff. I think a lot of people, I think even I have done it, where I kind of question some of the people that are considered for the Hall of Fame, which is fine. But I think if you make the list, there is someone out there believes you belong in it, and odds are you kind of have to be considered. And there's a lot of guys who maybe don't quite make the cut, but they were very good wrestlers, and they definitely deserve to get at least some nomination or some consideration for the Hall of Fame. It really comes down to us, the voters, to decide who is and isn't we believe is a Hall of Famer. And like I said, that's how that works. It's and there's a lot of guys on here. Like I was looking through the list, and like I mentioned with Sergeant Slaughter, it really came down to him, Kerry Von Erich, and Junkyard Dog. And to me, Slaughter kind of had the edge just because of a terrific, all-around wrestler, and he had a longer career because he didn't, he pretty much, he pretty much stayed intact and didn't pass away at a young age. It would have been interesting to see if, and I think that would have been the hard thing, is that not only did Kerry Von Erich and Junkyard Dog die at a young age, they really didn't have, they never really showed that they were going to be able to recover from whatever issues they were having health-wise or mentally. So it was going to be something that it was going to be very difficult for them to make it to the, relive the glory days, so to speak, of their the era that they were successful in. Yeah, so that's about it for this week. I hope everybody enjoyed this episode. Like I said, I wanted to just give out my picks for the Hall of Fame. If you have some thoughts of who you would consider Hall of Fame worthy, by all means, you could send me. You could discuss it on Twitter with me. I'm usually on there most of the time. For whatever reason, during this pandemic, well, you know what it is. During this pandemic, the LA sports teams have been doing far better. So we just won the NBA title. The Lakers, they just won them. And yes, I do. When the Lakers win, I do use we. When they lose, it's them. That's right. That's how it works. But there's been a lot more sports, so I've been watching a lot of that more often. And I haven't watched a lot of CMLL because they're on Ticketmaster Live. It's not that I wouldn't pay to watch these shows, although some of them I wouldn't, because some of them the lineups look awful. But I think the problem I have with Ticketmaster Live's, what they're doing is that they don't have the VOD option, the video on demand option. And if they did, I would automatically order these and then watch them later. Unfortunately, if you order them and you can't watch them, I mean, you're pretty much screwed. You lose out on, the lower priced ones are $5, and then the bigger shows are $13. So you have to pretty much be home to watch them. And unfortunately, for whatever reason, sometimes I just can't watch them because obviously if the Lakers are playing, I'm going to watch that. If the Dodgers are playing, I'm going to watch that. And then there's so much other stuff I watch with, thanks now that I watch a lot of older wrestling right now as well. And there's a lot of lucha that I watched in the past, but I'm rewatching a lot of that stuff just because it's so much more enjoyable for me to watch that stuff. So that's what I've been doing lately. We'll be doing more shows. I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to do as far as later future shows. I haven't really decided. Obviously, we could do special shows on different things just because I'm not really watching a lot of current stuff. I'll try to watch some AAA a little more frequently. That's the hard thing also. Like these shows happen at the during times when I'm not even home sometimes. So it's like, the good thing is with AAA, at least they put it on YouTube or they're actually putting it on Facebook. So there's a way to watch it. CML is going to be a little bit harder to do. This may end up being a lot of shows where I talk more about AAA. But yeah, that's about it for this week. Thanks everyone. Be sure to visit LuchaWorld.com for all your latest Lucha Libre news. And for old school wrestling reviews, go out and check RetroWrestling.com. For added content like podcasts, the Lucha Magazine write-ups, and the Video Vault that's available at the $5 reward tier. Check it out at our Patreon at patreon.com/LuchaWorld. Also be sure to check out the Retro Wrestling YouTube channel where you can find more content like the Retro Wrestling reviews. The Lucha World podcast is on there as well in case you would rather listen to it on YouTube. We also have every Saturday the Stan Hansen Saturday episode where we look back at a Stan Hansen match every week. And there will be more content on there as well, including stuff that I will be doing later on. Check that out. Subscribe. Be sure to like videos when you're on there. Thanks everyone again for listening to this podcast. So long.